Here we have the ABKO Hacker KN01 Electro-Capacitive keyboard. I've been trying to get my hands on a Topre board for a while now, but the prices have always held me back as they are quite expensive. Even the NIZ knockoff boards have risen in price. After searching around, I discovered this board by ABKO, which uses NIZ switches for around $115. That's considerably less than either a NIZ or Topre board, so I decided to take the plunge and try it out. Topre and other EC clones are famous for using rubber domes as part of the electrocapacitive switches. You hear rubber dome and probably think of a membrane keyboard, and therefore something pretty shitty, which is fair. But Topre boards are literally built different. I'm not going to do an entire deep dive on how a membrane keyboard works, but if you're curious, there's a really good video by Branch Education that goes over it. I can tell you why they stink though. First, most of them are cheap and built like crap, like those $20 joints you'd find in an office environment. If you can buy them for that cheap, imagine how much they cost to make. Second, they require you to bottom out each keystroke when typing. Unfortunately, that's just how membrane works, but it means sometimes key presses might not register, so the keyboard doesn't feel good to type on. Lastly, there's sometimes a problem with key rollover, or how many keys can be simultaneously pressed at once. I think this is a problem with how these boards interface with a computer via USB rather than membrane itself. But anyways, it's really only a problem if the limit is something like 2 key rollover. 6 key rollover is pretty common and is more than enough for most people, unless you're doing some stupid shit like this. When you put all this stuff together, it's no wonder rubber domes get such a bad rap. So let's see how electrocapacitive switches work. This keyboard uses an imitation of Topre switches originally designed by the Topre Corporation, a Japanese engineering company. The most popular Topre clones are NIZ switches. Technically, ABKO calls these switches Noppoo. I don't know if they're ripping off of NIZ 2 or what, but it's clearly some kind of derivative, and we gotta draw the line somewhere. Here's a breakdown of a Topre switch. The keycap is attached to a slider, which is secured in the top housing. Under the housing and the slider is a rubber dome, but much higher quality than what you'd find in most membrane boards. Underneath the dome is a cone-shaped spring. Unlike in an MX-styled switch, these springs have very little return force, just enough to return it to this cone shape. The switch rebound comes from the rubber domes. This spring is part of the electrocapacitive tech. The plates underneath it measure the change in capacitance as the spring is flattened to register a key press. The use of capacitance gives Topre some unique qualities, such as part-way actuation and the ability to customize how deep into the key press the switches will actuate. You'll commonly see Topre and its clones marketed as non-contact, since it doesn't rely on contact-based actuation like an MX switch. For a more detailed explanation of Topre switches, I'd refer to Thomas's or Hirosran22's video. Well, I gave that a shot. For my money, this is the best Topre breakdown out there. For Topre and its clones, what it really boils down to is the unique key feel and sound profile of higher quality rubber domes. The EC tech just makes it more palatable for modern use cases, including gaming and just the fact that it's a contactless offering. People that have used both often say that the NIZ domes don't feel as good as Topre in terms of tactility at a similar weight. However, NIZ somehow manages to do really well in the sound department. Part of this is due to NIZ switches coming silenced by default. They use a thin rubber ring that sits on the base of the slider, so when it rebounds to the top of the housing, the impact is dampened. There are silenced Topre boards available, but you'll have to pay more on top of the already hefty Topre Premium. I once saw someone describe the NIZ sound as boiling water, which is a pretty fitting description. It's got a pretty unique thwack to it, and tends to sound better the slower you type. If you're into the whole custom keyboard thing, the NIZ slider uses an MX-compatible stem as opposed to Topre's tube thing. This makes MX-based keycap sets compatible. As for the KN01, ABKO is a Korean company, while NIZ is a brand of the Chinese company EPO Maker. So a Korean company is using or copying Chinese tech that itself is copied from a Japanese company. That's a nice tour around East Asia if I do say so myself. ABKO has been around since 2001 and is South Korea's largest domestic gaming gear brand. As such, I'd say their standards are in line with other gamer brands. At least that's the impression I got from the box. The board is available in black or white, but the white was completely sold out from the seller I bought from. I think I prefer the black though. This is a nice looking board. There is also a Bluetooth variant and an updated version called the KN01C, both of which will run up the price tag. Looking at videos and pictures of this thing, it wasn't clear to me, but the chassis, or at least this top layer, is made of metal. I could tell right away when I unboxed it since it was physically cold to the touch. At nearly 800 grams at this size, it is a pretty dense feeling board. Around back, the USB-C port is quite recessed into the case, so depending on how thick the end of a cable is, it might not fit in there. The board has some flip-out feet, and I'm assuming the screws to take it apart are underneath the rubber pads. Here's a full list of the features. In the box, you also get a cleaning brush, one of those shitty keycap removers, and a braided USB A to C cable. There's this little booklet for all the functions, but unfortunately the entire thing is in Korean. This is a TKL, or 87 key form factor, which omits the numpad. It's also a somewhat old model. I believe it came out in or around 2020, as that's when ABKO posted a video of it on their YouTube channel. The switches come in two weight offerings of 45 and 55 gram domes. I went with the 45s. The only other time I've used tactile switches was several years ago with MX Browns. Those aren't that tactile to begin with, and I no longer have access to the board for comparison. It was a bit of a weird sensation typing on this after using linears on my main slabs for the better part of a decade. I was slightly worried about the 45s being too light, but I actually really like them. The tactile feedback is noticeable to me, but would definitely be more pronounced at the heavier 55 gram offering. You notice it the most when repeatedly pressing the same key. In any case, it's a different experience than with MX switches, but definitely not a bad one. I was also a bit concerned about how these would fare during gaming, especially in action games where you're holding down keys such as WASD to move. I think in this regard going with the lighter weighting was a good call. Again, it was a little strange at first, but I got used to it pretty quick. No complaints. Without taking the board apart, it's a bit hard to tell, but I think the stabs might be slightly lubed. They're still not good, but that's generally how it goes for pre-builds like this. The spacebar, for example, is pretty bad. At least this board uses cherry stabs, and not those weird Co-Star ones that a lot of these Topre clones have used. The box says that the keycaps are double injection PBT. In this case, that means a thin layer of PBT being the outer and then this translucent layer right under the top of the keycap to let the RGB shine through. They are OEM profile, which is slightly taller than cherry profile. There are Korean letters lasered on the front and various functions printed on the south side. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, like this one that lets you toggle between 6 key and N key rollover. I don't really know why you'd need that, but then there's some weird ones, like what the hell is this supposed to be? I ran a line from the manual into the translator and it said that it's meteor shower mode. So I'm assuming most of these are related to RGB. Under the nav cluster is a set of lock lights, and across from that there's this M button. I think you're supposed to use this to set macros, but I lack the instructions to know how to properly do that. As for the RGB, I've never really cared for it, so you be the judge. There's certainly plenty of modes for it, I'll give it that. My only other gripe is that I wish there was a function to adjust the volume. Most TKLs I've used have had that, but this one doesn't have any programmed by default. I was able to track down some software online, and even though I believe I set it up properly, I still couldn't get it to work. Mechanical keyboards were a brief pandemic hobby for me. It was a costly one, and the setup I had in the last keyboard video I made was what I was using up until now. I made reference to Topre in that video, and even though this isn't technically Topre, it's still pretty damn good. At the price I paid, it's more or less unbeatable. Genuine Topre boards retail for more than double, and whether or not those are worth that much is up to you. The ABKO KN01 gets a solid recommendation from me. It's well built, feels unique, sounds awesome, and comes with a couple of bells and whistles such as plentiful RGB and adjustable actuation depth. The Topre experience is a cool one, and for a fraction of the cost, this is a good way to try it. That's all for this review. Thanks for watching.